Okay. You hear me okay? Okay, so we're going to start with a quiz on exactly that topic. This is the flag of Norway, and this is the flag of... that was a trick question. So, yeah, Shetland and not Scotland. This is the flag of Scotland. Don't confuse the two. You won't find that on Shetland. Shetland, Scotland. And you won't find that on Shetland. And you won't find that in Scotland. And that's the flag of... I don't think anybody in the British Isles would know. That is the flag of Ireland, but obviously not the Republic of Ireland. This was the flag of the whole island of Ireland when it was in union with the United Kingdom. But nobody knows that, unless you look closely at this flag, which is... It's not Great Britain, it's the United Kingdom. I'm intending to confuse you completely today because nobody even in Britain understands this, or maybe very few. So that flag is incorporated in this flag in the diagonals, which represent Ireland, except not the Ireland of today, the Ireland that was part of the Union, but they didn't get around to changing the flag after Ireland became independent in 1921 and seceded the 6 states that became Ulster. So this continues to be the representation of Ireland today, but it's wrong. Anyway, so the blue represents Scotland, and the St. George's Cross represents England, but there are 4 nations in the United Kingdom: England, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and... so where's Wales? So the Cross of St. George, what's called the Cross Saltire of St. Patrick, Ireland, but it's not the Ireland of today, and the Cross Saltire of St. Andrew, which is Scotland, which make the Union Jack, as of 1801, which was the union with Ireland. But that is the flag of Ulster. So that should really be on the Union Jack, but nobody can be bothered to change it. Plus, it now has, well, as all flags do, political ramifications in terms of the sensitivities on Ireland. So, everybody clear? Crystal clear? You thought your country was divided. So Northern Ireland, Scotland, England, and Wales. Wales is not on the flag. That's the flag of Wales, with the dragon. So if you really wanted to include the 4 nations, the Union Jack would look like this. Well, maybe the dragon might be a little smaller. Anyway, nobody's about to change the flag, and that would still be wrong because it would still have the wrong flag of Ireland in it. So, as long as you got all that in your head before you land on the shores of Edinburgh, you'll be okay. So this, we said, was Shetland. That, we said, was Scotland. England, and what's that? The Royal Standard. So that you'll find flying over, right, only if the monarch is in. Otherwise, they'll fly the Union Jack, but the monarch's palaces in Scotland only fly this because the Royal Standard has the 3 lions, which represent England, so they fly that, not to offend the Scots. There we go. Crystal clear? And just to totally confuse you, this is the United Kingdom, Great Britain and Northern Ireland, which doesn't include the Isle of Man. It doesn't include the Channel Islands, because they are not part of the United Kingdom. They are crown territories that are not British, but they have British passports. So, what about Shetland up there? It is in the United Kingdom. It's very strange for me going to a country that doesn't feel at all like a country that I'm familiar with, or country or province or dependency or region or whatever you want to call it. It's part of the country that, in theory, I was born in. And they clearly are nowhere near the mainland, as we've discovered, right out there in the North Sea. So I bring this up because we're sailing through these waters, and this brings me on to the oil story, which I'm going to talk about briefly in a moment. But that gives you an idea of the oil fields and the gas fields of the North Sea. And the reason I connect the two with nationhood and states is hopefully going to become clear, because as ever, if we follow the money, we start to understand the politics. So this is natural gas and oil fields in the North Sea divided by nations, if you like. The British had a large slice of the pie. The Norwegians did pretty well. As we've discovered, they used their money very carefully and wisely. The Danes had some North Sea oil, the Germans too, some of the Dutch. But the lion's share went to the British, and Shetland was in the middle of the action. And I talked briefly about decommissioning one of the rigs, which is happening at the moment on the east coast of England, and the fact that Shetland has done very well out of oil, which our guide didn't really refer to. She didn't even refer either to the large oil terminal on Shetland at Sullom Voe, which has been part of the economy of the island, or the archipelago, I should say, for many years, since it was built in the 70s. And recently, to bring the story right up to date, a huge new oil field has just been discovered called Rosebank, and it is just outside west of Shetland. Rosebank is projected to be 500 million barrels of oil over its lifetime, almost triple the size of the controversial Cambo oil field that was recently mothballed because of political problems. So it is a contentious issue, not least, of course, because Shetland may or may not derive some benefit from it. The main contractor for that oil field is called Equinor, which is the new name for Statoil, which was the Norwegian oil company owned by the state. So the Norwegians are still very much involved. That's the corporate picture. This is the non-corporate picture. There's obviously a move to try and stop it from many different voices in the UK. So I'm not going to get into ecological issues today, except to say, as I said before, the UK has not done very well in terms of creating a sovereign wealth fund, which is currently worth £20. But it does explain maybe a little bit about Shetland politics, because there's a move to leave the United Kingdom to maybe align themselves with Norway. It's not got a lot of traction at the moment, but there is some talk about realigning themselves, which may explain why they don't fly the Scottish flag or the Union Jack on Shetland. They feel a little bit left out. They feel they haven't had a decent slice of the pie. They look at the Faroes and Norway doing very well, with much stronger state subsidies than they've been getting from Scotland, and they don't feel very Scottish or British in many cases. So that's just to bring it up to date, if you like, and we've talked a little bit already about the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund and how well they did. So I'm just going to start my little story way back in the distant past, from the very start of our journey out of the savannas. This is kind of bringing us back to the very beginnings of our move from Africa and into all sorts of other areas. And this explains, if you like, some of the reason why we keep moving that I've been describing in the sagas and the Vikings' journeys west and east, and to some extent also explains how Shetland got settled. We have basically been on the move. And why have we been on the move? Because we've been looking to chase new resources. And that's the story, if you like, of oil too. Not least in the Ukraine, where we are obviously seeing a big part of the oil story today. Basically, if you follow the money, you start to understand the story of the black stuff. So I'll kick off with a good contentious quote, which I always think is a good thing to do in the morning, based on the work of Richard Kapuscinski. Oil is above all a great temptation. It's the temptation of ease, strength, wealth, fortune, power. It's a filthy, foul-smelling liquid, squirts obligingly up into the air and falls back to work as a rustling shower of money. To discover and possess the source of oil, it feels as if after wandering long underground, you've suddenly stumbled upon royal treasure. Not only do you become rich, but you're visited by the mystical conviction that some higher power has looked down upon you, the eye of grace magnanimously elevating you above all others, electing you his favorite. The concept of oil expresses perfectly the eternal human dream of wealth through happy, lucky accident. In this sense, it is a fairy tale, and like every fairy tale, it's a bit of a lie. So, I like that quote. Maybe it actually addresses what Doug was talking about in his lecture about the chauvinism, let's say, or pride of the Norwegians. Perhaps less so about the British, but we are dealt the hand we're given, but it's also about how we play that hand too. So lucky accident, but how do you play that lucky accident? Anyway, let's go right back to when we first started seeing references to oil in the written texts. In the writings of the Greek historian Herodotus over 2,500 years ago, in history, we first see a description of Darius the Great, who was king of Persia, who mentioned some foul black liquid with a revolting stench. And 400 years later, in 77 CE, Pliny the Elder describes some thick black liquid. The time was added to cement to strengthen the walls of the ancient city of Babylon. Pliny also claims, helpfully, that it was useful for keeping away snakes, toothache, leprosy, epilepsy, gout, and coughs. So, just in case the clinic is closed, you can always do yourself a little cup of crude. And as a little touch to Pliny the Elder, if you want to invest in an oil field, there's a shale field in the US named after him. There you go, there's my stock tip for the day. So what were we looking for with this stuff? Well, obviously, today we don't really see oil as a medical remedy or a building material, although obviously we use it for our roads. It was essentially in demand for this stuff, kerosene. So this is really predates our need for oil for transport. Anybody know really the main uses of kerosene back then, or even now? Lighting, cooking, heating as well. Very combustible, of course. So it was really the powerful combination of the discovery of the oil wells, their exploitation and consolidation in the US by men like Rockefeller and his Standard Oil project, and also, which we should really understand, is the arrival of the need for it, of course, developed by people like Henry Ford and his techniques of mass production, which led to the arrival of the Model T in 1908. So that clever combination developed the demand. The entire nature of industrial development across the world now begins to change. So when Ford starts building his massive factories in Michigan, all this has a significant effect on the mindsets of the incumbent imperial powers of Britain, Germany, France, and others who start becoming increasingly concerned about this upstart nation called the United States. It's obviously getting ahead of itself, and it has access to this increasingly valuable resource called oil. And these new production methods, of course, which is this powerful combination that threatens essentially to destabilize the power networks of the relatively cozy European empires. But the US itself also has competition in the shape of an oil boom that has been exploding elsewhere in a very different part of the world, in Azerbaijan, close to the city of Baku. And we don't really, unless you're in the business or you're particularly interested, refer much to this part of geopolitical history. But Tsarist Russia at this point in the early 20th century has seized control of the region, and importantly, the oil fields of Baku then become a tug of war with the Ottoman Empire, and eventually Tsarist Russia seizes control of the strategically important port city, or port town, I should say, of Batumi on the other side of the Caucasus from Baku. And that means, of course, that it can get to what is obviously very important today, and I referred to in my last talk, the Black Sea, and it can start to export that oil wealth to the new demands of an emerging market in Europe. So they start giving the US a run for their money in terms of who can get oil to the Europeans. And in the meantime, the old empires, particularly the British, are trying to gain control of Arabia, which clearly becomes a massive part of the oil story. But they weren't, at that point, in the early 20th century, that interested in oil, because oil hadn't really been discovered or established or confirmed in this part of the world. This is essentially a control mechanism, especially for the British, but for the French too, to maintain their trade routes through Suez to the old colonies of India, East Africa, Australia. So this is essentially what the British end up doing. They have the protectorates that you can see in pink, Aden, particularly important, these strategic ports, what are known as the Trucial States that become the UAE later down the line. But this is not an oil story at this point. It will become, though. So all of this is essentially an element of what's known as the Great Game, the rush to control this Mideast section of the world, and the push against Russia, and Russia pushing back against the Ottomans, and the Ottomans trying to maintain control of Constantinople. But Britain, meanwhile, has started drilling. I love this picture. It's actually much later, it's from the 50s, but Britain has made a first oil strike in Persia or Iran in 1908. But as I say, they have no particular idea about the vastness of the deposits that they're just scratching the surface of. But nevertheless, because of the strategic importance of the region, Britain and France and Germany and Russia too are competing fiercely to gain control of many parts of the Middle East. Kaiser Wilhelm makes a pact, cozies up with the Ottomans. He completes the strategically very important Berlin to Baghdad railroad, which goes through Istanbul or Constantinople, the heart of the Ottoman Empire, and consolidates the German control of the region. So just when you thought it was getting a little bit heated, it heats up even more. Franz Ferdinand is assassinated in Sarajevo. And of course, since that first oil well in Persia, the Arabian Peninsula has taken on greater significance, but everything now starts to become hugely more politically driven, and it leads at the beginning of the First World War to the disaster that is Gallipoli. The British and the French press on with their plan to try and control Constantinople. Gallipoli is obviously a terrible disaster for the Allies, but it leads to something that we know less about. We're familiar to some extent of the disastrous consequences of Gallipoli, but we're less familiar with this. It's called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and I think it's probably called that to sound really boring. Because if you want to make sure that nobody pays any attention to something, you give it a really dull name. This is effectively the carve-up of the Middle East that the French and the British agreed in the middle of World War I, while they were at loggerheads in other parts of the world. They then effectively made sure that after the war they would maintain or increase their control of these regions. And you can see British rule really extends across what is now Iraq, and the French take Syria and move into parts of what was the Ottoman Empire, which will become Turkey. So all of that to say, it brings us, if you like, to World War II. What is the significance of World War II in terms of oil? It is hugely more important. World War I was not really an oil story, but World War II will essentially become very much an oil story. I've made reference already to Operation Barbarossa, which was part of Hitler's obsession, you could say, or concern that without oil he would not have the resources to maintain his campaign. And it was very much an attempt not only to move into the USSR, but down to the areas that would give him access to Baku and Batumi in the Caucasus. So that's really a little quick overview of the first half of the 20th century and oil's role in it. But the effect of the loss of the Nazis over Barbarossa meant that his capacity to then try and attempt an invasion of Britain was diminished, and it led to the successful Normandy landings of 1944. So in a sense, the oil chase that was Barbarossa, maybe, you could argue, diminished the Nazis' ability to continue westwards. By 1945, all of that meant that the old empires had technically won the war, but Britain was bankrupt essentially and is now struggling to pay its bills. It's struggling to maintain control of its empires, and by 1947, India gains independence. So because of that, Britain's priorities start to shift in the Arabian Peninsula. Control of the colonies becomes less important. It starts to focus instead on protecting the more important oil revenues and oil reserves that it's finding increasingly in the Arabian Peninsula. So the aftermath of war, we have the development of NATO, and NATO wants the old empires to diminish their role in the world, because after the war nobody has any great interest in seeing those empirical powers flexing their muscles, and yet there is the need to try and protect oil security and the supplies from the Middle East. So the Royal Navy is given the task, or assigned the task, of being that security force in the Middle East to secure and ensure supplies of oil that are increasingly starting to come out of that Arabian Peninsula. What happens at that point, of course, is that we start moving into the Cold War, and the Russians, or the Soviets, I should say, are unhappy with this emerging Arabian oil field strategy that they see NATO as setting up in contrast to their own oil needs. And they then start to fund this man, Gamal Abdel Nasser. You've come across him, who was at that time president of Egypt, and they encourage him to take control of that hugely significant Suez Canal, which Diana will be sailing through in September. So what happens? Suez becomes the hot point, the flash point, essentially of oil supplies, but obviously other trade too. Britain and France do exactly what NATO had told and hoped that they would not do, which is they start to flex their muscles in the old empirical spirit. They fail to tell the US that they're intending to invade Suez, and NATO starts wondering what this collaborative, cooperative force was meant to be, because they act essentially independently with Israel to invade the Suez Canal zone. What happens after that is that Nasser, with the support of the Soviets, blockades Suez, and all the oil supplies and the other trade that goes through it are thrown into doubt. What they have to do after that is to move oil, instead of going through Suez, as well as other trade coming from the east, around the Cape. And you can imagine, I'm sure, the implications of that in terms not just of time delays, but cost too. All of that creates the exact opposite of what NATO had tried to establish. This idea of security coming from the Middle East, making sure that the oil supplies were assured. What we get is a decade of blockade and obstruction in Suez, and the Europeans increasingly find supplies of oil difficult to get hold of. So who do they turn to for their oil? To some extent to the US, but they turn to the Soviet Union. So their play, if you like, the Soviet play of supporting Nasser, turns extremely profitable for them, because in the height of the Cold War, at exactly the point when you would expect the Europeans not to be that interested in trading with the Soviets, they need oil more than ever, and they find it in the Soviet Union. So in the early 60s, as I say, at the height of the Cold War, Nikita Khrushchev announces the construction of something called the Druzhba pipeline. And this, to some extent, brings us right back up to date and also connects with my story about the Vikings. I'm not going to try and bring them into the story right now. But the Druzhba pipeline, otherwise known as the Friendship Pipeline, is still the main pipeline providing oil to Europe today. And it goes right through Ukraine. So, Druzhba starts operating in 1964, and it pumps oil to the dismay of, obviously, the Kennedy administration, which is not at all happy about this rapprochement between Europe and the Soviets. But despite his demands that Europeans apply sanctions to the pipeline concept, Druzhba is extremely successful. As I say, it's still the principal pipeline from which oil is piped from Russia into Europe today. So this new energy relationship between Europe and the USSR starts to define everything that happens pretty much in the second half of the 20th century between those two continents. And it's known as Ostpolitik. It is essentially the brainchild of Willy Brandt, the German chancellor at the time, and it wasn't just about oil, of course, for the Germans, but it was especially important for the Germans because Willy Brandt's strategy was that in trying to create this rapprochement, this friendship, if you like, with the Soviet Union, there was the groundwork being made for potentially the reunification of the two Germanys. And that was, in the background, part of the logic. Again, driven by the need for oil. But what happens at that point, of course, is that the US decide to retaliate. They're not at all happy about this new coziness, so the US decide to hit the Soviets hard and declare a massive price drop. The Soviets, not fazed, they simply match the price drop. It sparks a price war, and it then upsets all of the other major world oil producers who don't want to see their oil price reduced as massively as it's occurring between those two huge powers. What happens is that the smaller oil producers get together and they create OPEC, Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. Anybody know which of the countries founded OPEC? No reason why you should, but interestingly, it was Venezuela that was the main driving force behind the idea, even though we associate OPEC to some extent with the Arab producers today. So OPEC strikes out on its own. It decides to create new markets outside of this kind of USSR rivalry, and it really essentially leads to a new sense of nationalism, if you like, among these new oil-producing countries. And these are the cracks that start to show, if you like, in the foreign policies of the old empires, because they hadn't banked on OPEC. So what happens? Well, all sorts of new deals start to be carved out, and in particular, if we go back to the whole point about Suez, the British have started to massively lose their reputation for being anything like the kind of power that should be controlling oil supplies in the Middle East. They are hugely diminished in terms of their reputation among Arab nations by the bombing of Suez in '56, and at that point, many of the Arabian nations that are starting to form start to point to this as the worst of the conspiracies that they can hold the British and the French accountable for. So independence for the Arabs starts to become a big priority. And in the early 60s, Harold Wilson decides that it's time to start to withdraw. The British are no longer welcome, if they ever were, in this part of the world, and the British declare that it's time to pull their forces out completely of the Arabian Peninsula. America regards this as a total betrayal. The promises after the Second World War to assure oil security in the Middle East were something that were pivotal for those decisions. And Lyndon Johnson decides it's time to change Harold Wilson's mind with a package of financial support, but this is the 60s, dude. Nobody wants a war in the Middle East. Everybody wants peace. We're building up, obviously, to the peace movements of the Vietnam War, and there is neither the political interest or the capacity in the US to replace Britain as a guarantor or a security force in the Arab countries. So by 1971, Britain has completely withdrawn its military presence, and Nixon has no interest in replacing the British. So what do? What does the US do? With the British forces gone, America really has no choice but to essentially elect some of those new Arab nations to give undertakings to ensure that oil security without getting involved militarily. It does not go well. The Saudis and the Iranians have no great desire to do what the Western countries need, and they start using their newfound power to become increasingly uncooperative. And as a result, supplies wobble. And if you know anything about markets, wobbly prices are not good for the market at all. It leads inevitably to price spikes through all this political insecurity, and it provokes the oil crisis of the 70s. Anybody remember that? How was your experience of that in the US? No good? Were you queuing at gas stations? So these photos are from the US. I remember this. I don't think you had this. They switched off all the lights for most of the days of the week in the UK. We had a 3-day working week. But all of this to say, this all came from these price spikes that started to happen because essentially, some simplification of the story, the British decided to pull out, the Americans decided not to get involved, probably very sensibly, and these new independent nations who had become part of OPEC start to see and feel a sense of national independence that they can start to consolidate and use politically. So we have a very strange time in the 1970s. It all gets very wobbly, and oil is the center of that story. It's also the center of this story, which is kind of weird when you think that oil was causing us headaches, but we created a storyline that maybe made us laugh or enjoy anyway, the shenanigans of the oil picture. As a result of all of this chaos, of course, we get Jimmy Carter, who commits the US to future intervention. So in other words, there will be a commitment to any external threat on American energy in the Middle East. But, of course, what he can't prevent is what's already unfolding. In 1979, key ally of the US, the Shah, has become deeply unpopular at home, partly because of this suggestion that Iran would cooperate with the US, and the Iranian Revolution is underway, and our friend Ayatollah Khamenei becomes the leader of Iran. So thanks to the Carter Doctrine and the US sanctions on Iran, we now see the loss of Iranian oil supplies to the market, which builds the price back up, and it all gets even worse. We get the Iran-Iraq war. Iraqi oil production now falls off a cliff, as well as Iranian, and the price goes up even further. And who benefits from all of this new price spike? The USSR. Because right through the 70s, the Soviet Union had been basking in the rustling shower of money that Kapuscinski described in that text that I read out. And under our friend and comrade Leonid Brezhnev, oil prices have been going through the roof. And what does the USSR do? It decides to use that to fund military expansion in Afghanistan. What could go wrong? So the price spike basically bankrolls the 70s in the USSR, but of course with a price spike we get oversupply, and what goes up must come down, and the oversupply leads to a price drop and a crash in the 80s, which leads to recession, which in turn means the USSR, that has become dependent on all of this fancy new oil wealth, is no longer able to fund its hugely expensive campaign in Afghanistan. It pulls out, and there's a systemic crash in the Soviet Union, which leads to perestroika, and our friend Gorbachev, who introduces his tardy structural reforms that don't eventually work. 1989, the collapse of the Berlin Wall, and the Soviet Union is no more by 1991. So that's kind of a mad rush through the 20th century connected to oil. But could we say that the oil price generated most of these events, or fueled, if you like, excuse the pun, most of these events? It's difficult to make a direct comparison, but there's usually an oil story going on somewhere in the background. As I say, the collapse of the Soviet Union may have been brought about through this massive price spike and crash of the price of oil. We could talk about lots of other things. We could talk, obviously, about the first Gulf War. We could talk about the second Gulf War. We could talk about lots of regions that are oil producers that I haven't even touched on, including, as I briefly mentioned, Venezuela, Romania, which played a massive part in the strategy of the Second World War with big oil deposits. Clearly, Africa, lots of oil-producing nations there too. But I think, hopefully, for now, I'm trying to illustrate at least the role of oil in many of the things that we've experienced over our lifetimes and how maybe it was going on in the background, tweaking some of these geopolitical decisions. So to come right back up to date, to some extent, anybody know this man? Olaf Scholz, Bundeskanzler of Germany. So in 2022, there was a fundamental shift in that Ostpolitik that I referred to before. Olaf Scholz decided, just after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that it was time to dismantle Ostpolitik, that it was time to stop demanding, buying Russian oil. It is obviously a huge shift in the European landscape because Russia has the oil, and apart from the North Sea that we're sailing through, which, as I say, is more or less peaked, and some Romanian oil fields, Europe essentially doesn't. And given that we messed up, screwed up, or were chased out of Arabia, we basically still have huge dependency on Russian energy. But today, Olaf Scholz's argument, which was that by refusing Russian oil, we would essentially starve Russia of the revenues that it was getting from buying their oil and gas. Did it work? Well, of course, today, Russia has new friends to sell oil to, and it is not in the same situation as it was 100 years ago, where it was desperately trying to find markets in Europe. It clearly can sell to China and India, two hugely emerging nations. So hopefully that's all lifted your spirits and set you up for the day. But it's not all bad news, because I bring you good tidings. The green energy transition, folks, it's all about to change, as we know from traveling through Norway. Right? Right? I'm not feeling it. Just look out to starboard. Right. All the oil. Yeah. The wind turbines. Right. So the hippies were right. We're going to be okay, as the Norwegians have shown us. And this is a great statistic that I enjoy looking at. This is Norwegian EV purchasing. So this is 2024 new vehicle sales, 90.2% were electric vehicles. So, it's good news, right? In Norway. That is phenomenal, though, right? So 2023, 84%, 24 rather, 90% new EVs. The great transition from oil will have taken place very shortly in so many emerging countries, not least Norway, of course. And there will be no more gloomy energy stories that people like me will be telling, because, of course, we'll be okay. Except this is the country that holds most of the lithium deposits in the world. And of course, that's reassuring. You will obviously be aware of the fact that lithium and cadmium and many other rare earth and minerals are held in lots of contentious geopolitical nations, and not least of which is, of course, China. So, will our children be telling the sticky story of the lithium wars, or our grandchildren maybe? I can't tell. But for now, anyway, what hasn't changed in a century is, of course, the history that energy is a pretty dirty story. What could possibly go wrong? Thank you, folks. Very happy to take questions. We have a talk coming up in 15 minutes, but feel free to, not questions, chime in with your thoughts. I'm trying to be provocative, of course. Hi. Thank you. So I don't know if you caught much of that, but just to paraphrase, the campaign against the Nazis was very energy-based in a sense, if I've understood what you've said, very focused on depleting and destroying the energy sources and stores, and absolutely, it kind of corroborates my story, if you like. We like to think a lot of the time that these are land grabs. It's how we're taught in school to some extent. Nazis invade Poland, Nazis invade Czechoslovakia, Russia invades Ukraine. But a lot of the time, it's not the landmass that's the important part of the story. So yeah, thank you. Hi. Absolutely. So lithium is an ongoing story. Battery technology is an ongoing story. I believe, I don't know how many of you are EV drivers, I believe that is clearly where so much R&D is going at the moment. I think solid-state batteries are becoming a new thing. I believe Toyota are doing interesting things with solid-state. They've actually held back from EVs in order to put their money into solid-state batteries. It could be that we're at the very beginning of, I don't know, obviously we are at the very beginning of EVs. EVs is just a tiny part of the story, though, of course. I mean, we still fly around in gas-guzzling aeroplanes. So, interesting. Where was that, did you say? By Imperial Valley, so big lithium deposits that have been discovered. Fascinating. Right, yeah. So, yeah, and right. So geothermal obviously is a huge story. Hydro that we saw in Norway too. And it kind of brings me back to my very first point about Shetland. Our guide very noticeably didn't touch on the Rosebank oil field at all, but it's clearly contentious whether we develop this massive new oil field or not. Economically, it's always this battle, isn't it, between economics and green issues. But yeah, and maybe at some point lithium will be redundant because there'll be new technologies. The question was, can I explain about solid-state batteries? No. That is way above my pay grade. Right. I believe that they are smaller, lighter, more efficient. It's kind of what we do, right? It's, if you think back to 20 years ago when we had laptops that, I don't know, had 1 megabyte of RAM. This is a fascinating idea. So the point is, in the US there were electric cars way back 50 years ago, did you say, or further? I've seen a photo, and of course photos never lie, of an electric bus in London, not a tram, but an electric bus in 1908. What happened to that? So we can start a whole conspiracy story about that too. Right. And combustion engines are pretty smart. They work. Right. Yeah. Leaded gas, we all remember that. Yeah. Right. Yes. So things are getting better. Can I finish on that note? Thank you very much, folks. Appreciate it.